There is a specific kind of cold that lives inside a hospital radiology department. It isn't just the temperature of the air conditioning, it is the sterile, colorless indifference of the place. It smells of ozone and rubbing alcohol, the scent of a world where human beings are reduced to biological mechanics, broken levers and cracked pistons. I sat on the crinkly paper of the exam table, clutching my right wrist against my chest. It was throbbing with a dull, sickening heat that radiated all the way up to my elbow. I am Victor. I am 82 years old. For 40 years, I managed logistics for an armored transport company. I moved gold bullion, uncut diamonds, and government bonds across state lines. I secured assets. I assessed risks. I ensured that nothing moved without authorization. Now, I was the asset, and I was broken. "Hold still, Mr. Sterling," the technician had said earlier, twisting my swollen arm onto the plate. It did more than pinch. It felt like the bone was grinding against itself. But I didn't cry out. You don't cry out when you've spent a lifetime taught that silence is the first line of defense. I looked at the digital screen on the wall where Dr. Evans was currently frowning. He was a young man, barely 30, with tired eyes and a stethoscope that looked too heavy for his neck. He was scrolling through the grayscale images of my arm. "The fracture is clean," Dr. Evans said, tapping the screen. "A distal radius fracture. Painful, but it will heal." I nodded, staring at the floor tiles. "I slipped," I mumbled, reciting the line I had practiced in the car. But I hadn't just slipped. The bathroom tile in my son's house had been slick, greasy, like someone had spilled baby oil and wiped it up just enough to leave an invisible trap. I remembered the feeling of my heel sliding, the loss of gravity, the hard impact of the porcelain tub against my arm. I remembered Karen standing in the hallway a moment later, not running, just watching. "Mr." The doctor's voice brought me back. He wasn't looking at my wrist anymore. He had zoomed out on the X-ray image, panning up toward my shoulder. He was squinting. I asked. My voice was raspy. I hadn't spoken much in 3 days. Robert and Karen didn't like it when I talked too much. They said it agitated me. Dr. Evans asked, turning to face me. "Or any kind of medical implant? A chemo port?" "No," I answered, shifting on the paper.
"I have a plate in my left knee from '98, a skiing accident." "That's strange," he murmured. He leaned closer to the monitor. "Because there is a foreign object in your upper left arm." He pointed to a spot on the screen. I squinted. There, floating in the gray, ghostly web of my muscle fibers, was a tiny white capsule. It was small, cylindrical, about the size of a grain of rice. It glowed with the stark white contrast of metal and glass. "It looks like an RFID tag," Dr. Evans said, mostly to himself. He stopped. He looked at me, then back at the screen, uncomfortable. "In dogs," I finished for him. The room went silent. The hum of the computer fan seemed to roar in my ears. I stared at that tiny white pill on the screen. I felt a phantom itch in my left arm, a spot I had scratched absent-mindedly for months. And then, the memory hit me. It hit me harder than the fall in the bathroom. 6 months ago, the flu season, my daughter-in-law, Karen, had come into my room with a syringe. She smiled that smile of hers, the one that showed too many teeth, like a shark sensing blood in the water. She was a veterinary technician before she married my son. She handled animals. She knew how to restrain them. "This is a special booster, Vic," she had said, swabbing my arm with alcohol. "New strain, very dangerous for people your age. Robert and I just want to keep you safe." I remembered the pinch. It had been sharper than a normal needle, a heavy ache that lasted for days. "Just a reaction," she had told me when I complained. I sat there, gripping the edge of the exam table with my good hand, tracing the location on my own arm where the faint white scar lay hidden under my sleeve. I had ignored it. I had trusted them. They lied. They hadn't vaccinated me. They had chipped me, like a stray dog, like cattle. I looked at the doctor. He looked concerned, maybe even suspicious, but he didn't know the context. He didn't know I lived in a house where the phone lines were monitored and the internet router was locked. It must be a mistake. I whispered, forcing my face into a mask of confusion. Maybe... Dr. Evans didn't look convinced, but he didn't press it. He didn't know he was looking at a crime scene. I sat there, gripping the edge of the exam table, listening to the doctor type his notes. They told me the scar was a reaction to the vaccine. They lied. They branded me because they didn't see a father or a grandfather. They saw an asset that might wander off.
If you've ever looked into the eyes of your family and realized they were calculating your expiration date, hit that subscribe button. Because I wasn't going to let them treat me like livestock. I was going to show them what happens when the animal breaks the fence. "Wrap it up, Doc," I said, my voice hardening just a fraction. The ride home was silent. My son, Robert, drove. Robert was 50 years old, but he drove like a teenager with a permit, nervous, jerky, constantly checking his mirrors. He was a weak man. I had tried to raise him to be strong, to be decisive, but somewhere along the way, he had hollowed out. Now he cowered before his wife, shrinking whenever she raised her voice. He glanced at me sideways. He looked guilty. He always looked guilty these days. "Did they?" Robert asked, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He knew. Of course he knew. He probably held the flashlight while she injected me. "No," I lied. I stared out the window at the passing suburbs. Just a fracture. Robert let out a breath that fogged the window. "Good. That's good." Karen was worried. "I bet she does," I said. We pulled into the driveway. The house loomed over us, a McMansion with too many gables, and a lawn that was manicured to within an inch of its life. It used to be my house. I signed the deed over to them 3 years ago when my wife passed, thinking I was securing my legacy. Instead, I had signed my own incarceration papers. Karen was waiting at the door. She wore yoga pants and a tight athletic top, looking vibrant and healthy, a stark contrast to my gray skin and broken bones. Her eyes scanned me instantly. She didn't look at the cast on my arm. She looked at my face, searching for signs of rebellion. "All fixed," I said, shuffling past her, playing the part of the stumbling old man. "Just need to rest." "Go lie down," she commanded. I walked to my room on the first floor, the guest room. I closed the door. I didn't lock it. I wasn't allowed to lock doors. I sat on the bed. I rolled up my left sleeve. I pressed my thumb into the muscle of my arm. I felt it, the hard, unnatural lump under the skin. The logistics manager in me woke up. If they tracked me, there were parameters. Every security system has a perimeter. Every perimeter has a blind spot. I needed to know the range. The next morning, I initiated a test. I waited until Robert left for work. Karen was in the kitchen, blending a green smoothie that sounded like a jet engine. I put on my shoes. I opened the front door. "Ad," I called out. She shouted back over the blender. I stepped out onto the porch. I walked down the driveway. I counted my steps. 10, 20, 30. I reached the mailbox at the end of the driveway. It was about 50 yards from the house. I took a step past it, onto the sidewalk. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Ding. A loud, distinct chime sounded from inside the house. The blender stopped instantly. 5 seconds later, the front door flew open. "Dad!" Karen yelled, running down the driveway in her bare feet. "Dad!" She wasn't worried. She was annoyed. "Just thought I saw the mailman," I stammered, stepping back toward the driveway. "You can't go that far," she scolded, grabbing my good arm and steering me back. "You'll get lost. You know your memory isn't what it used to be. You have to stay within the yard, Vic." It was a geofence. I was tagged. As soon as I breached the perimeter, her phone alerted her. I walked back to the house, head down, acting chastised, but inside, my mind was racing. I couldn't use the house phone. They monitored the call logs. I couldn't use the computer. It had a keylogger. I had seen Robert installing it. I needed an ally. I needed technology that wasn't compromised. Wednesday, grocery day. I sat on the porch, waiting. Usually, Karen brought the groceries in herself, but once a month, she ordered a bulk delivery from a service. A white van pulled up. I squinted at the logo on the side, Miller Logistics. My heart skipped a beat. Miller. Jack Miller was an old contact of mine. We had worked together in the 80s. He ran a small fleet now. He wouldn't be driving, but the kid driving the van worked for him. The driver hopped out, a kid with headphones and a nose ring. He started hauling crates of water up the driveway. Karen was inside on a conference call. I could hear her shouting about marketing synergy. I stood up. I walked over to the driver as he set down a box.
Wrapped inside it was a scrap of paper I had written on in the bathroom with a pencil stub. "Here, son," I said, shoving the bill into his hand. "Thanks, Pops," the kid muttered, stuffing it into his pocket without looking. "Wait," I whispered, gripping his wrist with my good hand. "Read the note inside. Give it to Miller. Jack Miller. Tell him." The kid looked at me. He saw the desperation in my eyes.
He saw the cast on my arm. Just give it to Miller," I hissed. I stepped back as Karen opened the door. "Vic, get away from the poor man," she snapped. "Inside." I went inside. Now, I waited. 2 nights later, midnight. The house was dark. Robert snored in the master bedroom upstairs. Karen slept like the dead, confident in her digital fence. I crept out the back door. The sensor there only chimed if opened. It didn't track distance unless I crossed the property line. I disabled the door chime with a magnet I had stolen from the fridge, a trick from my armored car days. I walked to the tool shed at the back of the garden. It was dark, smelling of potting soil and gasoline. I waited. 10 minutes later, a shadow detached itself from the trees behind the fence. A voice wheezed. "Miller," I breathed. Jack Miller stepped into the moonlight. He looked old, older than me. He was breathing hard, clutching an inhaler, but his eyes were sharp. He was carrying a small black duffel bag. "I got your note," Miller whispered, climbing over the low fence with a groan. "Package compromised? That's Code Rad Vic." We ducked into the shed. I closed the door. "They chipped me, Jack," I said, rolling up my sleeve. Miller swore softly. He opened his bag. He pulled out a handheld device that looked like a large remote control, a signal frequency detector. "Hold still," he said. He ran the wand over my arm. Beep, 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 beep. The device lit up red. "It's active," Miller whispered, looking at the readout on the small screen. 900 megahertz range. He tapped a few buttons. "It's not just GPS, Vic," Miller said, his face pale in the glow of the screen. "It's transmitting biometrics. Heart rate, body temperature, blood oxygen." I asked, though I knew the answer. "No," Miller spat. "Safety chips are passive. They only ping when scanned. This is active telemetry." Miller pulled a tablet from his bag. He was always a tech wizard, even back in the day. He started typing. "I'm tracing the packet destination," he muttered. "It's bouncing. Bouncing. Got it." My blood ran cold. And a trust management firm," Miller confirmed. He looked up at me. "Vic, do you have a specialized trust?" I have a long-term care policy," I said, "and the trust I set up for Robert." "I'm hacking the protocol header," Miller said. "Here it is. Conditional release clause." He turned the tablet to me. I stared at the numbers. $10,000. Every month. "If you leave the fence," Miller explained, "the payment stops. If you die, the payment stops and the principal goes into probate, which takes years. But as long as you are alive and stuck here," I felt the nausea rise again. I wasn't a pet. I wasn't a father. I was a paycheck. They weren't keeping me safe. They were farming me. They were keeping the cattle in the pen so they could milk the account dry. I asked. "I can," Miller said, reaching for a scalpel in his bag. "But if the signal dies, the money stops." "Let them know," I started to say. Suddenly, a light flicked on in the house, the back porch light. Karen's voice drifted across the lawn. "Dad." Miller froze. "Go," I whispered. "Leave the scanner. Leave the jammer. Come back tomorrow night." Miller shoved the device into my hand. He vanished into the bushes like a ghost. I stepped out of the shed. I clutched the scanner in the pocket of my pajama pants. Karen was standing on the porch, wrapped in a silk robe. She was holding her phone. The screen illuminated her face. She looked angry. She called out. I walked toward her, limping slightly. "Just checking the shed," I said. She narrowed her eyes. She looked down at her phone. "You need to come inside, Vic," she said, her voice cold, metallic. "Your heart rate is racing, 110 beats per minute." She walked down the steps. She reached out and gripped my left arm. Her fingers dug into the muscle, pressing right over the chip. A warning, a reminder of who held the leash. I looked at her. I saw the greed in her eyes. I saw the calculation. I smiled. It was a dry, humorless smile, the smile of a man who has just figured out the combination to the safe. "No accident, Karen," I said softly, pulling my arm free. "Pain is usually a warning signal, a biological alarm bell telling you to stop, to retreat, to protect the damaged tissue. But sometimes, pain is the only proof that you are still the owner of your own body." I sat on a metal stool in the dimly lit garage of Jack Miller's house, 3 blocks away from the prison I called home. The air smelled of sawdust, motor oil, and the sharp antiseptic sting of rubbing alcohol. My left arm was bared, resting on a workbench covered in a clean shop towel. A leather belt, my own belt, worn soft by 20 years of use, was clamped between my teeth. Miller stood over me. He was wearing a headlamp that cast a harsh, circular beam onto my tricep.
In his hand, he held a scalpel he had sterilized with a butane torch. "There's no anesthesia, Vic," Miller said, his voice low and steady, the voice of a man who had defused bombs in the desert 40 years ago. "I have a bottle of Jack Daniels." "Pour it," I grunted through the leather. "On the arm, not in the throat." Miller nodded. He uncapped the bottle and tilted it. The amber liquid splashed over the patch of skin where the tiny white scar sat like a target. The alcohol burned, but it was a cold burn compared to what was coming. Miller asked. I nodded. I squeezed my eyes shut. I bit down on the belt until my jaw ached. The first cut felt like a line of fire being drawn across my skin. It was sharp, precise, and agonizingly hot. My body instinctively tried to jerk away, but I forced myself to remain freezing still. I was a statue. I was a rock. I was the logistics manager who had stared down armed robbers in 1985 and didn't blink. I felt the pressure of Miller's fingers spreading the incision. I felt the cold steel of the forceps digging into the meat of my arm, searching for the foreign invader. "It's deep," Miller muttered, his breath hitching slightly. She buried it right in the muscle fascia. I groaned, a low, guttural sound that vibrated in my chest. Sweat broke out on my forehead, stinging my eyes. The pain was blinding, a white-hot star exploding in my shoulder, but beneath the agony, there was a strange, savage joy. This wasn't just surgery. This was an exorcism. "Got it," Miller whispered. I felt a tug, a sickening pop, and then the pressure released. A tiny sound, the sound of metal hitting glass. I opened my eyes. I spit the belt onto the concrete floor. I dragged in a lungful of air that tasted of sawdust and victory. Miller was holding a small mason jar filled with saline solution. Floating in the clear liquid, bobbing gently like a horrific little message in a bottle, was the chip. It was small, white, and stained with a streak of my blood. "You're off the grid, Vic," Miller said, reaching for the suture kit. I looked at the jar. I looked at the hole in my arm where my family had tried to stake their claim. "Not yet," I spit, wiping the sweat from my eyes with my good hand. Miller worked quickly to stitch me up, 6 black sutures, neat and tight. He taped a heavy gauze bandage over the wound. "The rig is set up," Miller said, gesturing to a laptop sitting on a stack of tires.
Connected to the laptop was a small transmitting dish pointed at the jar. "I've cloned the signal frequency. I'm spoofing the biometric data." I stood up. My knees were shaky, but my mind was razor sharp. I asked. "I have the GPS coordinates locked to your living room," Miller said. I picked up the jar. I held it up to the light. It looked harmless, just a piece of glass and silicone, but it was the key to a $10,000 a month lock. "I have to go back," I said. "Vic," Miller said, putting a hand on my shoulder. "She won't," I said. "I'll wear a sweater. I'm always cold, remember? That's what she tells people." I slipped the jar into the deep pocket of my cardigan. It felt heavy, heavier than gold bullion. "Saturday," I said. "The birthday party." "The investigators are briefed," Miller confirmed. "They're waiting for your signal. They want to catch her monitoring the fake feed." I nodded. I shook Miller's hand. I walked back to the house. I slipped through the back gate, bypassing the sensor I had disabled. I went into the guest room. I sat on the bed. I pulled up the sleeve of my sweater. The bandage was white and stark against my skin. It throbbed with a rhythmic pulse of pain. I heard the front door open. "Karen!" Karen's voice rang out, cheerful and breathless from her workout. "I'm home!" I pulled my sleeve down. I composed my face into the mask of the befuddled old man. "Just resting my eyes," I called out, my voice cracking perfectly. She walked into the doorway. She checked her phone. I saw her thumb scroll. She was checking the app. She smiled. She saw a heart rate of 72. She saw a compliant asset. "Good," she said, pocketing the phone. "You rest up. We have a big day Saturday. Your birthday." "I'll be ready," I whispered. 3 days later, Saturday. The house was transformed. It smelled of expensive catering and deception. Karen had gone all out. There were silver balloons floating against the ceiling. There was a banner that said, "Happy 83rd, Victor," in tastefully muted colors. There were fresh flowers on every surface. The guests began to arrive at 6 p.m. They weren't my friends. My friends were dead or retired in Florida, or guys like Miller who operated in the shadows. These were Karen and Robert's friends, neighbors who drove Teslas, Robert's golfing buddies, people who looked at me with that specific blend of pity and impatience that the wealthy reserve for the inconveniently elderly.
And, crucially, the targets were there. Mr. Henderson, the trustee, a man with a comb-over and a suit that looked too shiny, he managed the disbursement of the funds. And Mrs. Gable, the notary public, who Karen used for all her documents. I sat in my designated corner in the living room, a prop in my own life. "Come in," a neighbor shouted, leaning in too close, speaking too loudly. "Thank you," I nodded, clutching a glass of water. Karen fluttered around the room like a hummingbird made of steel. She was playing the role of the sainted caregiver perfectly. She guided guests to the buffet. She accepted compliments on her patients. She checked her phone every 10 minutes, ensuring her investment was still ticking. Robert stood by the bar, drinking scotch too quickly. He wouldn't look at me. He knew something was wrong. He had seen the way I looked at him in breakfast, cold, detached, but he was too cowardly to ask. At 7:30 p.m., Karen clinked a spoon against her champagne glass. "Everyone!" The room quieted. Karen stood in the center of the living room, holding Robert's hand. She beamed at the crowd. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. "We know it's not every day someone turns 83. It's a blessing." She paused, wiping a non-existent tear. "I won't lie. It's been a hard year. Taking care of Vic, it's a full-time job. The medical needs, the confusion, the constant worry that he might wander off and get hurt. It takes a village, truly. But Robert and I, we made a vow. We vowed to keep him safe, no matter the cost." The guests murmured appreciatively. "So brave," someone whispered. "And," Karen continued, gesturing to the large projection screen she had set up for a photo montage, "we wanted to share some memories." She raised the remote control for the projector. "Let me help with that," I said. My voice cut through the room. It wasn't the raspy whisper of the past week. It was the voice of a man who used to shout orders over the roar of armored trucks. I stood up. I walked to the center of the room. I moved smoothly. The limp was gone. Karen froze. "Dad, what are you doing?" "I'm not tired, Karen," I said. I pulled a remote control from my pocket, not the one she had, a universal remote Miller had programmed. "I prepared my own slideshow," I said. I pointed the remote at the screen and pressed play. The screen flickered. The image of a smiling baby Victor didn't appear. Instead, a high-resolution digital X-ray appeared. Gray bone, dark muscle, and a glowing white capsule in the upper left arm. The room went silent. The murmurs stopped. "Shh," someone asked. 6 months ago, I announced, facing the crowd, my daughter-in-law injected a tracking device into my arm without my consent. Karen's face went white. She dropped her champagne glass. It shattered on the hardwood floor, exploding into shards. She shrieked, rushing toward me. "Robert, grab him! He's having an episode!" I roared. I turned to look at her, and the fury in my eyes stopped her gold. "She did this," I continued, turning back to the stunned guests. "Not because she loves me. Not to keep me safe." I looked directly at Mr. Henderson. He looked like he was about to vomit. "Mr. Henderson," I said, "you know the clause."
As long as I am alive and residing within the geofence of this property, the trust pays out $10,000 a month to the caregivers. Henderson swallowed hard. $10,000 a month, I repeated. That is why I am here. Karen screamed. It's for his safety. He wanders. I asked. I clicked the remote again. The screen changed. It wasn't a static image anymore. It was a live feed of an app interface. Centurion Life. Subject, Victor. It showed a map of the living room. It showed a green dot. Status, safe. Heart rate, 72 BPM. 6 Fahrenheit. Look at the screen, I commanded. It says I am here. It says I am calm. I reached into my pocket. I pulled out the mason jar. The saline swirled. The bloody white chip bobbed in the liquid. A gasp rippled through the room. And this, I said. I grabbed the sleeve of my suit jacket. I ripped it upward. I grabbed the gauze bandage on my arm and tore it off in one motion. The stitches were black and angry against my red, inflamed skin. The incision was raw. I held my arm up. The realization hit the room like a physical blow. The guests looked at the screen, which still showed a steady heartbeat. They looked at the jar in my hand. They looked at the wound on my arm. The data was fake. The app was a lie. The fraud was absolute. Karen stared at the screen. She pulled out her own phone. She saw the same lie she had been monitoring for 3 days. She realized that the signal she thought was her leash was actually a noose. You, she whispered, her face twisting into a mask of pure hatred. You.
But she never reached me. Robert stepped in front of her. He caught her by the shoulders. "Stop it," Robert said. His voice was quiet, but it was firm. For the first time in 20 years, he looked at his wife not with fear, but with disgust. Karen screamed, thrashing against him. "He ruined everything!" "It's over, Karen," Robert whispered. Blue lights flashed through the front window. Sirens wailed, cutting through the silence of the suburb. Miller had made the call. The front door opened. 2 uniformed officers entered, followed by a man in a gray suit carrying a briefcase, the fraud investigator from Centurion. "This," the investigator asked. The party dissolved into chaos. Guests fled toward the door, avoiding eye contact. The officers handcuffed Karen. She was screaming now, blaming Robert, blaming the doctor, blaming me. She was dragged out, kicking and screaming, past the silver balloons that celebrated the life she had tried to commodify. Robert stood alone in the center of the room. He looked at me. He looked at the stitches on my arm. He looked like a child who had woken up from a nightmare, only to find the reality was worse. "Dad," he croaked, "I didn't know about the chip." "You knew enough to stay silent," I said. I didn't wait for his apology. I didn't want it. I walked past him. I walked past Mr. Henderson, who was frantically typing on his phone, trying to save his license. I walked out the front door. The night air was cool. It smelled of rain and exhaust. I walked down the driveway. I walked past the mailbox where the invisible fence used to be. I stopped. I waited for the chime. I waited for the ding of the phone. I waited for the shout. Silence. The only sound was the wind in the trees and the fading siren of the police car taking my jailer away. My arm throbbed. The stitches pulled tight against my skin. It hurt. It hurt like hell. But it was a good pain. It was the pain of a wound that was finally clean. It was the pain of healing. I looked at the gate at the end of the driveway. It was open. I walked through it. I stepped onto the public sidewalk. I didn't look back at the big house with the lights on. I didn't look back at the son I had lost. I simply walked into the darkness, a ghost returning to the world of the living, finally, completely off the grid.